Hello, we are Tangled Time, and we are not just a history podcast. Our podcast is a source of inspiration, a source of learning, and a deeper understanding of our own place in life and history. Be sure to subscribe to Tangled Times. We have a questions and answers group on our Facebook page, Tangled Time. It is a challenging time, and we all know that. So, through stories and lessons shared during our podcast, we hope you will find a new appreciation of history, of people around you, and all the complexities of leadership that you are pursuing. Answering the call of God, our guests, James Gillespie, Larry Hiller, and David Hochstetler, flew that airplane. How many times do you hear God's calling? How many times you tried to run away from that calling? And I think the stories of our heroes who are back in our studio today will inspire us. As well, we have today my co-host, Ted Whitmire, and we invited to the studio people who asked questions. So we have today people from Ekaterinburg, Russia. We have Julia Istomina Oden. She is my daughter. She was just 16 years old when she translated for the First Lady of Russia, Naina Yeltsina. That's how strange the time was. Imagine the First Lady invites a young girl to translate for her because she had little trust in people around her. Also, we have Elena Budanova, who was one of the first church members that we started in Ekaterinburg, Russia. We also have today with us Deborah Abbott. She had very insightful questions about that airplane. And when she asked them, I thought she needs to be in our studio to meet our guests in person. And also Scott Kiddo. Let's begin our podcast. I'm Dr. Lydia Istomina, and time is truly tangled. And without learning from our history, we cannot understand our reality.
Trying to understand it, appreciate it, and just respect, it was a huge accomplishment that we were able to connect between those two countries at that time. And so as I was appreciating that and just kind of thinking about you guys as individuals, probably like my age at the time, and making this decision to take this risk. I mean, because I'm sure there was a lot of risk involved in doing this, and there was a lot of people that supported along the way. So thanks for being here again, and I'm just curious, how you made that decision and how that experience impacted you when you came back.
I don't remember being hesitant or afraid to go. I guess I knew Larry and David were going to be there, so I felt secure in what was going to take place. And also I knew that there were a lot of Americans that and Russians as well that were praying for this venture to be successful. And I was not nervous about what was going to happen. Maybe sometimes the expression ignorance is bliss. Well, that's maybe where we were at that time. And there were to even get to deliver the food was quite an experience as well.
Black market and how, somebody sends food over somewhere and people are going to take it and use it for themselves. And that was just kind of the situation at the time, as there was that transition in the 90s there as the Soviet Union was collapsing. And, I'm still trying to appreciate that, growing up. I was born in 1986. So, I was a little kid when all that happened. So just trying to understand it, appreciate it, and just respect, it was a huge accomplishment that we were able to connect between those two countries at that time. And so as I was appreciating that and just kind of thinking about you guys as individuals, probably like my age at the time, and, making this decision to take this risk. I mean, because I'm sure there was a lot of risk involved in doing this. And there was a lot of people that supported along the way. So just the thinking of that scale of a mission that you guys were a part of. I just wonder, how you came to that decision, the struggles you had to deal with as you, left your family. How long were you gone? And
We're going to talk for just a few minutes about what the mission trip to Ekaterinburg meant to us individually. And for me, it was something that I wasn't sure what I was getting into, and I didn't know the hardship that was involved. And I think sometimes God works like that. That sometimes you're not sure where you're going, but through God's Spirit, we were able to feel along the way that God was with us the whole time. Particularly, I think that first day when we delivered the food boxes to the recipients, and they were all so emotionally overcome with what was taking place. It was became so evident to me when they would read out the boxes of where the items came from and what church. That made it so much more personal. And like I said, you could almost feel God's Spirit in the room each time that we walked in and made the presentation. And as I saw each person that received the box, I wondered and thought about where they had come from and how their faith had been developed, because it was so different than mine. It had been so much easier in the United States, and for the Russians that were the recipients, they had gone through so much, and yet their faith was always there, and they were an example to us. So that's an example of how meaningful the delivery of the food boxes in this trip was to me. As I think back on
The thing that stood out most for me was really how nice and open all the Russian people were, and the ones at the church, how they were open in their faith and how they professed it, and it was different than what we were used to here. Mm-hmm. And I was surprised at how open they were, and it was really nice to see.
I thought it would be a great adventure to go to a foreign country. I'd never been out of the United States at all. And when Dwight Ramsey approached me, I was reluctant a little bit at first, but then things fell in place and I was able to go. But rather than an adventure, it ended up being a spiritual trip for me. Mm-hmm. Like James said, I could feel God's presence in what we were doing. I felt like it was God's plan, and all we had to do is follow his calling, and it would be a successful trip. And speaking of trips, that's kind of how my faith journey has been. Not one individual event, but accumulation of things. And I can look back, and God has continued to bless me and to be part of my life.
I think that's true. And I hadn't thought about that before. Each of us it wasn't necessarily a leadership style, but we all had different gifts and talents that God has given us. And Larry, of course, had the medical skill and experience that he could share with the Russians. And David had the engineering type background and skills as far as management is concerned. And so I just kind of fit in and do what I could. So it all worked together, and that's the way it works in dealing with what God would have you to do. You don't have to do what's out of your skill set, but what God has given you, and use those for God's glory. And that's what took place. So thank you.
I enjoyed the fact that the Methodist Church does have a lot of emphasis on missions. The Louisiana Conference and VIM sponsored trips to both Cuba that I was able to attend, and as well as Mexico. And there are similarities in all of those missions. When you get there, you find people that warmly receive you and respect the fact that you're coming to sometimes share food, but sometimes just encouragement that they continue in their Christian path.
Yeah, I think each individual person needs to kind of look at themselves and see what they can do, and not maybe try to be part of a big project like this was, but work locally or regionally and with the people that you have in your local church, and do what God says there.
Individuals, we can look to the prevenient grace of God, his Spirit going before us. And even though we may not be sure what we're doing, that all of the acts of kindness and of sharing of gifts will be amplified by God's Spirit. So as we consider going on mission trips, just look to God for his guidance.
I think for each of us, it's finding out what God would lead us to do, and determining what our gifts and our talents are. And it may be local, it may be regionally, it could be nationally or internationally, but determining what our gifts are and talents is so important, so that we fit in. And for us on this mission that we all had distinct gifts, but we were all serving one purpose. And I think that was what was so unique about it. It touches so many people, and that's what's transcended all the decades and years since it took place. It's the same response from 1992 till today. It's the same thing. People respond in the same way to see the thankfulness and the joy and the love that was with those food boxes that went to people half a world away.
I didn't realize that there were a lot of spaces in that plan that hadn't been detailed out, but I accepted that on faith that it was going to be quite an adventure, and it really was.
I think we had a lot of support from the local Broadmoor church that helped a lot making our decision to go. We weren't that worried about what was going to happen because we knew the people around us, and they were good people, and we were going to be okay.
I remember when we got there and we were told that we couldn't hand out the food immediately, that there was a little concern there, but Lydia's father helped us so much in making sure all the connections were there, and that took place. So it helped at that point for us to rely on our Russian friends to make sure that the food was delivered. If I can talk just for a minute about what we had to go through to deliver the food, there were so many there were 3 obstacles, as I remember, and to deliver the food, and there was paperwork to be done, and we had to have these stamps of approval, and we tried to get that all done in one day. And the first place we went to get the stamp of approval, we seemed like we drove forever and ever to another part of town, and we walked in, and the people there said, "We are the first Westerners that have ever been in this office before." And y'all correct me if I'm giving some information that's not correct, but we handed out chocolate, and that helped a lot. That always paves the way, and we got the first stamp of approval. And then we went to the next place.
One of the places that we went to, they asked what it was that we brought into Russia. And so we had a manifest, and the question was what is the value of the products that we brought? And so I went through some calculations, just making guesses, and I came up with a total, only to discover that they wanted to tax us for bringing that food in. And my response is, well, you only tax things that you sell, and this is humanitarian aid. And if you want to tax us, we'll get in touch with the bishop and have him take all of the products back to the United States. And this was done, of course, through interpreters that we could only partially understand.
Mm-hmm. And I remember one thing that we were in an office, and they wanted to know about the quality of food that we had, whether it was good quality to bring in. And so we were trying to explain in our broken Russian, very broken, that this was good quality food that we had purchased, and the brand name that was on the food items was High Top, and that's a brand name for a local grocery store. And so the word "high" communicated to the Russians that this was good. So they said, "High Top must be good food," and so we got the stamp of approval there.
Along with that same event, we had to have the boxes inspected.
Mm-hmm.
And so we went into this lady's office, and it looked very, I would say, sterile, maybe even military. And she brought us in and she started opening some of the boxes. And I didn't know what she was looking for, but she was looking for insects or weevils. And I was thinking, oh no, because it's not unusual for little insects to get into cardboard boxes. But throughout that process, she saw everything was okay and gave her stamp of approval. And we also gave her some chocolate candy, and she started tearing up. She was going to give that to her son, and her son really didn't ever experience being able to get candy.
And that same lady, when we were getting the stamp of approval, I remember her showing us her grandchildren, pictures of her grandchildren. When we told her that those were the most beautiful grandchildren we had ever seen, and we showed her our pictures of our children, and so there was just a relationship based around our grandchildren that developed at that time.
So rather than being hostile, she was
Very
very,
nice.
very nice.
It's such an excitement to see people doing such extraordinary things. But unfortunately, now our reality is different. So it's now the war between Russia and Ukraine, and Russia is not actually in this situation a peaceful country. And so with all these implications, how do we look back and see ourselves in building that bridge? And how do you feel now when this bridge in a way collapsed?
It's terrible now situation. It's so terrible. I think before it was 30 years ago, 25 years ago, it was more best time than now, because we can have the beach, we just can have the plane from America, and it was so different. Now, if you want to send something to Russia, just me, I can't send nothing to my sister. I send nothing to my friends in Russia. From America, they did not have anything, any postal, any relationship, nothing. And if we try to be in Russia, every year I try to be in Russia, I need to go maybe use 2, sometimes 3 different planes to be inside Russia. And now if you will, for example, want to organize some help for Russian people, it will be not possible, because the advertising from Putin was so big, so great, and maybe 50% of Russian now hate American.
So a chance, individual would have to take a bigger chance even now than they took back on that flight because of the hostility. And what are the chances of people being able to leave there? I've heard they've cut off people being able to leave and go to other countries at this point.
Yeah, just my son, he's flight from Russia, 3 his friend, because if not, they will be in army now, and they will be in the war, and they will kill Ukraine people. But all Ukraine people, it's our friends, good friends, and now they are safe here in America. They will not to kill somebody.
But in order to reach out to people in Russia, in order to have the compassion that we want to have for people that are different than us, people that don't trust us, it's going to be even more difficult if you can't offer a piece of chocolate, if you can't offer a plane load of food because it would be rebuffed. How do we reach past it?
I'll say all the people that we dealt with back 30 years ago are now gone from the church, and we're dealing with different people in different circumstances. And I've gone to Cuba since going to Russia with a totally different crew than the ones I went to Russia with. But I think it's all part of the same thing in seeing and working with everybody.
Since that trip in 1992, I've been able to go to Ekaterinburg probably 30 or 35 times. And I can see the evidence of God each trip that we've taken, and the lives that have been touched and the people that have been touched in the trips that people from Ecaterinburg have made to Louisiana and to Shreveport, and they've traveled around the Louisiana Conference in the lives that have been touched. So it was the seeds that were planted in 1991 and 1992 that became evident over the years. And people from the church, from the First United Methodist Church of Ecaterinburg, that have gone into the ministry, that have shared their lives, and what this meant to them. And it started, Lydia, with you and with Dwight. And the evidence of that is coming forth now. Even though we can't see right now what's taking place in that church, we receive videos, we receive pictures, and we know that church is a vibrant church right now, even with all the difficulties that are taking place. So thank you for what you did.
Compare the political situation back at the time of the airlift between the U.S. or the West and Russia, and the present day airlift was, if I remember correctly, the Cold War had warmed up, come to a close. The belligerence of Russian leaders like Khrushchev, we will bury you. Much of that had fallen off, and so it was a new day had come, right, in relations, and there was a lot of hope, I believe, at that time, that maybe relationships could be developed, and certainly the act of this airlift was like an olive branch, I think. Maybe not on a governmental level, even though the government was involved, but on a personal level, where the people of America really do care about people in Russia and have a desire to develop friendship. But now today we're not in a Cold War, but there's this active hostility between the U.S. and Russia, but it's over Ukraine. And we as individual Christians and Americans, we still feel compassion for the people of Russia, but the environment is very different politically, right?
Oh, yes, it is.
Was the airlift during Glasnost?
It was, yes, it was.
Yeah.
But before Gorbachev?
After.
After Gorbachev. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeltsin was already in power.
So that was right after Soviet Union collapsed.
What would it take to break the barriers today?
From TV for all my Russian people that American hate Russian.
But I think also it's an important point that you at least are trying to reach out. So I don't know. I have had the same experiences where a lot of people I grew up with we had to stop communicating because, number one, it was not on the same plane. Number two, it wasn't safe for them sometimes to communicate if they did not agree with what's currently there. So I think that my answer to that question would be, despite everything, trying to reach out and trying to still make connections in a way that may not be as desirable as we would like them to have, or on the same level as we would like, right? Because we may be putting somebody in danger by even asking the certain questions. However, attempting to continue some sort of a relationship or some sort of a tie may be all we can do at the moment.
I would just say that the only thing I've been able to do is correspond by email. And at least that's a way to communicate and to let people know that you do care about them, particularly with the language. And we couldn't speak Russian and they knew very little English. But I think that facial expressions and smiles and the exchange of pictures was such a big part of it, because they could relate to our families and we could relate to their families. But the leadership style it's one of a relationship, and if people don't realize you care about them, they're not going to do what you want them to do. But if they realize that you care, and we realize they care, it makes a difference in getting through some hardships and some difficult times.
An interesting thing that we discussed today, Ukraine and the present situation, and I think it's very valuable. But because this airplane, since you know the whole podcast was about the largest military airplane ever produced in Russia, AN-124, that actually was manufactured in Ukraine. That's an irony. And also, I asked you, James and David and Larry, last time, did you know that the pilot, his last name is Ukrainian, so the crew that flew that airplane was from Ukraine. And that's what I thought, like, how wonderful that we talk about it now.
For me personally, it's all this cargo is not any of great importance than the relationship between two nations. So between the ordinary people, the friendship.
Because when time passes, you know how everything starts looking under a different light. Because we get older and we look at the things we've done, and probably now we think like, oh, we were so crazy. We were so crazy even thinking about it. But look at where we are now, and we still have the friendship. And we also, yes, we have maybe different views on how things happened and how they were arranged. But I'm so happy that you mentioned my dad, how he was working with you. And of course, having Julia here, it's such a good memory that, yes, the whole family was engaged, and it was hard. It was very hard. But again, so let's pass the political implications now and talk a little about medical side of that. Because remember, that's why Larry and David ended being on that a group chosen, because parallel to the food airlift, we had medical supplies. And after that, we had an interesting dynamic in the church. And to make a reference to that time, I need to clarify that our church was, first of all, just blossoming, growing very fast. And also, all the members, new members, were very highly educated people. We had people from university, and we had lots of doctors and scientists and PhDs, and Elena and Julia know that. And that affected, I think, our direction, the mission. And I think the vision was to connect professionals of different background. For example, doctors with doctors, scientists with scientists. And that's why, Larry, tell a little more about what was your vision, what you were excited about going to Ekaterinburg by that airplane.
Well, the medical supply, bringing that over was relatively easy. They spoke the same language we did, so medically it was easy. We didn't have any obstacles, and they understood what we were bringing and how to use it, and it was pretty seamless.
When you came to Russia, you brought quite a few pieces of medical diagnostic equipment. And at that time, our church got an access to diagnostic center from where we had quite a few church members. We scanned every church member. And then Lena Budanova's son was diagnosed with a critical kidney condition.
Yes.
Without this partnership, Lena, how do you think that would develop if you did not know what your son was going through? He was just 6 or 7 years old.
Yeah, he was only 7 years old. And I'm very thankful for our church and exactly for Lydia Istomina that she organized for the our church the special school for 6-7 years old children. And before to start this school, you organized like a check, and they check everybody. And they find that my son, he has a problem with the kidney, and and it was in the same time when delegation from Shreveport was in our city. And Dr. Bauer, he works very hard, and we have a visa, and we have the free tickets, we were in America, and it was like a fairy tale. Nobody believe it. And when I talk about it for some of my friends, they can't believe, and they answer me, "Oh, it was your dream, Yelena." It was so good time, and it was really fairy tales.
Thanks for sharing. That's really interesting that the impact this has had on you. And I'm curious, makes me think, what was the situation going on where all these people at the time needed so much food and medical equipment that the government was able to supply it. I know like there's the whole dissolution of the Soviet Union, and that caused a lot of hardship for a lot of people. But from what I understand, this city was, the third or fourth largest city in Russia, and yet it needed support from America, which it was amazing that people were able to do that and come together and provide that. But it's kind of strange to me to think this government let this happen to these people and yourself. So.
Now in Russia, they have all. They have chocolate, they have flowers from the different countries, they have meat from the different countries. They have sometimes more better food than here in America.
Except for the pricing, right?
The price is same like here in America, but the
salaries.
The salary 10 times less than in America. All people afraid in Russia now to be in American church, and just some, maybe only 20 people coming every Sunday, not more.
Yeah, that's very true. Thank you, Lena, for sharing that. You see how after 30 years, situations is not the same. And all the excitement that Larry and James and David brought with that airplane, probably now will be taken, God knows how, maybe like a threat. Let's talk a little about ethical consideration. That Julia had a question.
Well, to an extent, I already heard some of the answers. You have talked to the fact that there were some things that you encountered in Russia even, right? Like you had to make a relationship, you had to make a connection with people to even be able to get past the initial line of authorities and to get the things through. But my question also was in regard to, because I remember it to an extent, and also in years past when the airplane came back again, the Barksdale Air Force. And if you have any information on how was that viewed, because in one sense, the Methodist Church was in Shreveport, and there was also that military base in the Bossier area. So were there any differences that you have encountered from how people from different circles saw this mission, from military personnel to the church members?
I don't remember any animosity as far as from Barksdale or the Air Force people. I think there was the day before we left, I think there was a luncheon, wasn't there? There was a luncheon and the pilots were honored at Barksdale. I was not there. I wasn't invited, but David got invited. He was there.
It was an event that gathered both the Russian military and the U.S. military out there at Barksdale Air Force Base in Bossier City. And they had a luncheon, and there was an opportunity for representatives from each of the countries to share some comments. A lot of it just referred to the hospitality that the Russian military had received on base, that they were given pretty much a barracks to stay in, and were treated quite well, and introduced these Russian military people to the news media of our area. So there was a lot of curiosity, no hostility at all. We felt like that the hostility had already come and passed, and now was an opportunity to share common grounds and understandings of each other's culture and the needs of our different countries. And obviously the hope is that between these two strong nations, that a lot of good could be accomplished.
Also, this trip had got a lot of press coverage at the time, there on television as well as in the paper. And there was also a special section in the Sunday edition of the paper 8 days in the Katerinburg special a section that was included. So there were a lot of people that knew what was going on. It was very, very well received.
One of the interesting things that occurred is that the gathering of the food and medical supplies, it was multi-state churches and organizations that contributed to it. That when we returned, we were invited to different churches throughout the state just to share about the experience, because they had an investment in this mission by providing all of the food that they had done. So a broad area of interest in the things that were going on.
Thank you. That's actually a good question that raises again another question for me. You mentioned that a lot of churches were involved, and I remember that. I remember that when people were receiving food, there were carts from Jackson, Mississippi, as well as Louisiana in different places, right? So was it Broadmoor Methodist that was responsible for kind of that getting the word out to make sure that people knew?
Thank you, Julia, for this question, because, like I mentioned, there are different sides of the story. And since our podcast is called the Tangle Time podcast, and bringing hidden things to light. And I don't know, is it just because of Reverend Dwight Ramsey's kind of a humorous personality, but I remember when I was invited to his presentation when he was receiving honorary doctorate for this mission. And it took place at the First Baptist Church. And so I'm sitting on the stage, waiting for my turn. And so he's speaking powerfully. He is a charismatic person. And so he tells how ridiculous was actually that endeavor to ask Lydia to get that airplane. It's impossible. And he said, and suddenly Lydia calls and she said, I have an airplane. And but the story goes actually verbatim. He says, what airplane? I said, the one that you requested, AN 124, and it was pause. And he says, I did not know what to say. And next thing he said was, I had no food. And this whole sanctuary was packed. And I remember I sat there and everybody was laughing, and I thought I would just break down in tears because it was so many efforts to get that airplane. And now I hear that the truth was that there was no food. But then, of course, he turned it into then all the churches and organizations and nonprofits and United Methodist Committee on Relief that had this storage in Baton Rouge. And so this is how all these efforts came together. But I just remember that phrase when he paused and he says, and I did not know how to say, Lydia, I have no food. That was quite a revelation to me.
I do kind of feel like that Dwight Ramsey kind of spearheaded the concept. There were a lot of people in several churches that picked up leadership roles. And I don't know all of those because I think I was late coming on to be invited into the mission. But again, leadership popped up from several different churches and several different communities. And it was a really broad-based effort to get all of these things together. There were limitations and specific things that had to be packed into the boxes. It couldn't just be random. So there was a lot of detail that people looked after and provided the instructions for. The trip on the Russian plane really started off a great friendship with both Larry and James. And we didn't have to worry about which one would be the leader. We each had different skills. We each had different talents. And different times throughout the trip, different ones would step forward and take the lead, and it all ended up being a very successful event.
Do you remember Dunkelman family from Broadmoor? So I remember visiting this family with Dwight Ramsey and my dad. But that was interesting because he said, why in the whole world should I have these communists And I did not know what to say because it was, but people are hungry. Children are starving. But for him, it was quite an interesting kind of turn of the facts that his whole life, he said, he was not in favor of communists because it threatens the country. And I think, Ted, we talked about you and your family, how many times people of your parents' generation bring up those drills at school when they had to hide under school desks because of that nuclear war threat by the Soviets. And so here you prepared that airplane to go to those Soviets who made you probably hide under the school desks. Mm-hmm. That's quite a courageous act, I would say. A logistical question that was asked. How was it logistically possible to transport such a large amount of aid on AN-124?
Barksdale is a B-52 base, so it was already had runways that were used to big planes, and they could handle it.
Now, is an AN-24 similar to a C-5?
Yes. It's
Okay.
a little bigger.
Okay.
Carrying capability of the KC-10 involves a roller system for ease of loading on the aircraft. The AN-124 has a flat floor surface. We don't have the rollers, so we're using forklifts and having to floor load everything onto the airplane. It's much needed supplies. Everything that's going over there, food staples, medical equipment, medical supplies, much needed, and I'm glad to see it going over there.
It was a unique situation 30 years ago that I don't think it'd be quite possible to duplicate it unless you had somebody like Dwight Ramsey that was the linchpin of the whole thing. He got things in motion and was really the driving force behind all of us going. And I think it would take somebody like that to spearhead something else, another trip like that, but it'd be hard to duplicate that.
There are individuals even now that are doing food lifts around the world in countries that are being impacted by strife and fighting and so forth. So I know that things do take place, but as Larry said, it was very unique, and it was a special situation that took place in 1991 and 1992.
So we got Reverend Dwight Ramsey on the American side, and we've got you and your father was involved in orchestrating all of this. So would you say, like in Russia, I mean, the key party was you and your father and your church that you were just starting up?
Yes, all church members. Interestingly enough, we had military personnel loading this humanitarian aid on this military airplane on the Barksdale base. And similarly, Russian soldiers were unloading that military airplane in Ekaterinburg, Russia. So it's like it's a different layer of helping hands, in addition to our church members. And that was quite an effort because it was like over 80 tons, right, of food and medical supplies. So that's quite a big supply at once. But also, if you think, police was following the military trucks actually to take it to the city, and imagine to store these things without being robbed on the road. So the government provided us storages where the direct plan was to store it for a while before we start distributing it among families. And then here's again back to James and Larry and David, how you had this quite emotional stories of distributing these boxes and taking them to families.
One of the things that I think is remarkable is hearing the conversation and the questions about logistics, especially about Dwight Ramsey being caught off guard. What food? It reminds me of the feeding of the 5,000, that it really has to be a miracle, that there were so many reasons why it couldn't be successful, that looking back on it, I personally feel like it is a miracle.
Because you did feed the thousands. The lists of those families, names and addresses were long. Thank you so much, David, for this comment, because we all know, and Dwight knew that, and you knew that you cannot feed the whole city. And of course, one airplane cannot supply enough food for even maybe one district in our hometown. But that was not the point. The point was that it is a miracle. It is a miracle because people from two different countries, two different nations were able to work together. And I think that's what the miracle is. That people can overcome their fears, their biases, their prejudices, anything, just for the sake of experiencing something good. And bringing the miracle of this feeding the thousands, because you did feed the thousands.
Yeah, certainly the U.S. military has the capability and the capacity to handle missions like that, right?
But the willingness, right? You had to
That's
talk,
another matter.
right? Like, so you had a relationship with the U.S. military and Russian military, and so there were some pretty high-ranking officials involved in that, and so I assume Reverend Ramsey and Lydia were the points to communicate with those sources, right?
Right, and I think it was Lydia's also connection with Mrs. Yeltsin that helped quite a bit from the Russian standpoint to make sure that everything happened.
It's interesting they were able to provide a plane and fuel, but they weren't able to provide food and medical equipment. But they were able to go to this point. So that's nice, they're getting, reaching out from the U.S. To motivate that in some way. But yeah, it still kind of confounds me that that this was the state of their country at the time.
Also, I sometimes think about with everything that was possible back then, I wonder if it was partially possible because the country was in such a kind of a transitionary state. Not everything was worked out. Some things were already cast out and finished, but not much new and definitive was happening. So I wonder if sometimes the best things come when certain things are in flux.
This was the state of their country at the time, lining up for food and not getting the medical treatment they need, and just being excited about chocolate. So I'm glad to hear from Elena that that's not the case anymore. We're dealing with different problems as far as the whole relationship with Ukraine and the war and stuff. So there's different things to worry about. I'm glad they made progress in one way, but we've got some other work to do.
Certainly market conditions after the fall of communism, which is an economic system that had been in place for 70 years, as that system collapsed. And then Russia's trying to find their way, okay, what is our new economic system? And the market suffered significantly. Julia or Elena, can you comment on that?
Yeah, just now in Russia, economic, I know that it's go down, but the government, Putin and his government, they tell, oh, we're good, but it's good only for Moscow maybe, but not for all Russia, because in the all little country of Russia, the economic become just smaller and smaller. The small business go down, and nobody can have same money like it was before, maybe 5 years ago. It's a different. But some people who has the market, store, different shops, or they live very good. But the little small business, like a private little business, they feel not good. Many restaurants closed, cafeterias closed, and I don't know how it will be later, but I think not so good plan for future. And some my friends, who has business together with the foreign company, they finish this business and they don't know what to do.
As far as the sustainability of such large projects, it's with God, all things are possible. I think right now in Russia, with all the political things that are taking place, it doesn't seem like it will happen anytime soon. But I don't know that what the future will bring. Things change so quickly in the world. When people have a vision and a dream about what can take place, it can happen with God's backing and support. Who would have thought that in 1980, what would happen in 1991 and 1992? So to say that something won't happen, I think, is underestimating what God to do. I think to go with an open mind and an open ear, what God would lead people to do, I think that would be the answer.
So we invite people to look and view that podcast again, because the pictures speak for themselves. And the excitement and the happiness and the joy on the faces of people who were from America and from Russia, working together, taking these heavy boxes upstairs. Like James says, not a single building had elevators in them. Where you went. Of course, some did. But I think that was an example of togetherness. And I think with that example, we invite people to overcome the obstacles that are many now, especially with the war in Ukraine. But I invite you to go beyond what is common and maybe even normal, believing that ordinary people like James and Larry and David and Julia and myself, Elena, my dad, we could do miracles if we trust each other, if we continue working together. And I know, yes, Elena, many people try to get out of Russia, and Julia's father just recently with his family left, but that doesn't speak highly of our country, right? Because people in Russia with a low income, yes, there is food, but can you afford it? That's a thing. Can you be safe in that country in this time? And it's like no different from that time when you, James and Larry and David and Julia and Elena were in Russia. It's not different. We need to continue standing up for human dignity, for equality, and it does not matter what it takes, but it does take a miracle. It does take people who are now on the screen. And that's what I think it starts with, small group of people who can work together. Thank you, James, and thank you, Larry, and thank you, David, and thank you, Ted, for being a co-host in this podcast, and Elena, thank you for your story. That's quite a story, and I'm so glad that Dima, your son, is not just alive, but he prospers, and he has 3 children. And by the way, his son looks just like him on the picture. And Julia, thank you. Thank you for your sacrifices that you not willingly took upon yourself, but it's a story, and we will continue. Debbie, thank you for joining us today for your questions. And Scott, we welcome you again. We will continue. Send us your questions. This is just questions and answers after the podcast, The Flight of Compassion. That's a whole vision that we have to develop compassion toward people who are maybe not likable because of the political situation, but that's our vision and our calling. Right, Ted? Say something in the end before we say goodbye to everybody.
Yeah, that's right. And just want to thank you all for being here and sharing your stories and trying to find, ways we can connect with each other and with, our world around us, that we can do some good. It's a real inspiration to hear your stories. And I look forward to all our audience growing from that and continuing this conversation, right? There's more stories to dig out here, and thank you for your contribution there.
I just did not understand, Lydia, who pay for the fly for this big plane? Who pay for this?
Good question. It was given to us at no cost by the Russian government. And this whole story of meeting President's wife, Naina Yeltsin, is quite an interesting story. How about if we promise our viewers today that our next podcast will be about that? How did we manage finding her How did it happen? What was the environment? And that's quite a story, full of mystery and full of risk and danger. And thank you. That's a great question, Elena. And please share it with your friends. Share it with your church. Share it with your family. And also share it on your Facebook page. Whatever social media channel you use, put that link and then invite people to ask questions. The more questions like this, Elena, we have, and from Ted and from Scott and from Debbie and Julia, the more interesting the conversation will be. And I think that will be maybe one small step toward a better future and opening that goodness in us that we each of us have and people have. But I think they need to hear the stories like of James and Larry and David to know what motivated them and how did it happen. Tangle Time offers a valuable insight into making decisions with integrity, courage, and foresight. God bless you, and let's continue.